Hello! Today I want to make a brief video going over the history of the coif and how it relates to medieval fashion and living. This video is just intended as more of a cursory glance at this particular garment. I'll be focusing on the coif from about the 11th century to the 16th century, although it existed a little bit before and lasted all the way up until I want to say the 19th century. I'm not sure right offhand, so don't quote me on that, but the 12th to 16th century is when it was most common and used by the highest number of people. Okay, so diving in now, the coif throughout the Middle Ages was used as kind of a general head covering worn by all classes, lower, upper, middle. Pretty much everyone wore it at one point or another. You can see them in various effigy arts, frescoes, all that kind of stuff. Being worn just by themselves is just a hat. Being worn by peasants out in the field is work covering. You can see them wearing under hats in the same kind of contexts by nobles, by lower class. And you can also see them once in a while being worn in bed as a like little bit of a nightcap sort of thing. Now, in regards to the fabrics used for the coifs, the lower class, the peasants, would have used a coarser, rougher linen that would have likely been unbleached, while the nobility would have used a finer woven linen that would have been a brighter white. Okay, so now that we've established kind of how the coifs are made, what materials they used, who they were worn by, I'm going to jump into taking a look at the different styles throughout the centuries. Okay, so starting off, we have this 12th century example dated to around 1170. Here we have an illumination of two farmers harvesting wheat with their sickles. The bottom one in the red is wearing what we generally think of when we think of a coif. However, this one is kind of unique in that it has some blue decorations around the edging, which very well could mean that it's representing embroidery or some decorative stitching around the seams. I'll be talking more on the decoration of different coifs throughout the centuries as we go along, so just kind of keep in mind different variations you see from just the standard white coif, because I'll be talking about those. Jumping ahead 10 years now, we are taking a look at these examples from the Fee Camp Psalter, dated to around 1180. Now, in some of these coifs, you can kind of see the decorative edging around the coif, which could indicate embroidery. And we also see kind of a different construction pattern here. It looks like it might be a four-piece construction with two pieces taking up the skull of the coif, one on each side, and then also two other pieces attached to that, which make the lacing for the coif. Now, this visible difference in construction from the Hunterian Psalter could indicate a couple number of things. The first being a different method of construction, which could be regional to the people who drew these coifs in this manuscript. It could also mean a higher level of fidelity, a bigger image, so they'd be able to get more detail versus the smaller image in the Hunterian Psalter. Or it could just be a stylistic preference as well. My personal inclination, however, is that it's just a different construction method from that of the Hunterian Psalter. Now, moving to the first half of the 13th century, we have this coif that looks to be of two-piece construction, with more of the decorative embroidery and threadwork around the edge of the coif. The overall shape of the coif is almost identical to that of the previous century, and very likely of the same construction as well, as it looks like it is of the two-piece construction. It has the decorative embroidery along the side, and it is the same size and worn in the same way as the previous century. This isn't too surprising, as fashions didn't really change all that much or with very much rapidity up until the 1300s, the latter half of the 1300s, where it is often said that that's kind of when fashion really began as we know it today. Moving to 1250 now, we have these illustrations from the Mac Bible. And here we can see some lovely details of how the coifs are constructed and how they are worn. The majority of these coifs are of similar construction and shape and size that we have seen previously, that is being of the two-piece construction, but there are also two coifs shown here that are of a unique four-piece construction. Now, while there is a chance that this could also just be a separate cord that runs around the skull of the coif to kind of hold it in place, I am more inclined to think that it is indicating a four-panel construction for the coif. Two panels making up the upper half of the skull, and then the lower two panels making up the ear coverings and lacing of the coif. Another thing to note here is the lack of the embroidery or threadwork details around the edges of the coif, which could indicate that that style was falling out of fashion, or simply that it was not a common style in the area that the manuscript writers and illuminators worked. This next image is dated to 1260, and the coif appearance has all the characteristics that we've discussed previously, but it also has indications of that decorative stitching around the edges of the coif again, which we did not see in the previous manuscript from 10 years earlier, but we did see it in manuscripts almost 100 years earlier, which could help indicate that it was more of a regional style. But more research into the subject would be required to make a definitive answer to that. The next examples we are going to look at are from the lovely and wonderfully detailed frescoes depicting the legend of Saint Francis. They are painted from 1297 to 1299, so right at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries. They were painted in Italy by an Italian painter, which would indicate that it would likely be depicting an Italian style of coif, in this case likely worn among nobility, as more noble characters are being portrayed in these frescoes. Now, these coifs are unique in a fair number of ways. The first and most noticeable amongst these is that they are significantly smaller than previous coifs, being that they only really sit on the back half of the head and only cover up until about the ear, with one example not even covering the ear. They also lack ties to tie around the chin, but that is likely due in part to them being worn under the hat, which, being worn under a hat, you wouldn't need the ties to secure it under your chin to have it be secured to your head, as the hat would hold it in place. This could also indicate a shift towards the coif being more of a fashionable item in some areas versus a utilitarian item. This is due in part to the coif lacking any sort of functional bits like the ties to attach around the neck, or being bigger to cover the whole head and all of the hair. This seems like it's much more fashionable, as it just sits on the back of the head, only covers a little bit of the ear, and is worn exclusively under a hat. Now, shifting into the 14th century, we see that the coif is remaining the same as previous examples, with the exception of that Italian example that we just showed, in that they are the white coifs being of two-piece construction with the lacing going around the chin. There are no examples that I found of the decorative embroidery around the edges, which would indicate that by the 14th century that style had gone out of fashion and was really no longer around. And there was one example of the four-panel coif that we had seen earlier. Another thing to note is that you also start to see the coif fall a little bit out of fashion due to the advent of the hood as a wearable garment, and as a garment that really takes off during the 14th century. Now, looking at these examples from the first half of the 15th century, we see similar construction styles, the two-half coif with the tie around the neck, although there are a few notable differences. The first one among these are the way the coif is worn. In these two examples, we see these two men wearing the coif with the tie tied up around the top of the head to make a just sort of skull cap style garment instead of having it folded down around the ears, which this is something I didn't really see in previous centuries, so I thought it was unique enough to note in this video that this was a potential way to wear the coif, aside from just having it tied around your chin or having the ties just hang loose down. A couple other things to note are the coifs being worn under hats a higher percentage of the time, and also there's an example of a colored coif. It was black, which you didn't really see in previous centuries. For the second half of the 15th century, you don't really see coifs a whole lot. You see people just wearing hats by themselves or no hats, but once in a while you do see people wearing coifs. This image I'm using here is a good example of the second half of the 15th century of what people wore on their heads. A lot of the times it was just hats by themselves, or a hood with a hat, or just a hood, or no hat at all. And very once in a while you see someone wearing a coif. In this example, there's a small child wearing a coif on their head, whereas everyone else is wearing hats or hoods. Now, moving into the 16th century, we still see the coif being worn, although this time it is worn almost exclusively amongst the lower peasant classes. And when we do see it displayed in those contexts, it is almost always worn under a hat, if it is worn at all, and very rarely do you see it worn by itself, although I did include a few images of it being worn by itself to show that it was still worn in that context. But it should be noted that it was much more common to wear a hat or a hood versus a coif. There are also a number of unique instances of the coif in German fashion amongst German soldiers and knights, although it is very rarely a coif worn on its own, and it's more just an extension of the hats they are wearing. Although you do see once in a while a coif-like garment being worn, although it is often highly decorated with different slashes and cuts and having feathers and other decorations attached to it, resulting in a garment that is more akin to a hat than the coif of previous centuries. So that wraps up my video on coifs and their use and stylistic changes throughout the centuries. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a thing or two. I know I found out some new information that I hadn't previously known before looking into it more for this video. And also, again, to reiterate, this isn't intended as an end-all be-all source for coif history. It's just a quick little brief run through just to give you a rough idea of how they changed throughout history.